So we are today in Los Angeles at the worldwide headquarters of EEG Info organization specialized in neurofeedback. I am very happy to be with Siegfried Othmer, and I thank you for this opportunity to answer some questions about neurofeedback. So my first question is, we have seen in the history of neurofeedback several steps or several periods, and each time at the beginning of the period there was a new discovery or a new application. For example, the SMR with rhythm mu, and then other alpha theta and so on. So you are the one who started a new and very important new step in the history of neurofeedback, which is infra-low frequency. And could you tell us more about the importance for neurofeedback of this new step in the history of neurofeedback?
Yes, it turns out that all these techniques have a lot of commonality, and so there's a lot of overlap between them, even though everyone emphasizes the particularity in their particular method. Now, what drove us to the infra-low frequency region is that in our clinical work over the years, we've had an adaptive technique that adapted frequency to the person, and we were driven always to new frontiers by the most challenging people that we were seeing, right? The most difficult patients. Mm-hmm. And it was in about 2004, 2005 that it became very clear that the most difficult patients tended to pile up at the lowest frequencies that our software allowed for. Really? And that was still in the EEG range, 1.5 hertz. And so we needed to go lower. Now, our software didn't allow that at the time, so we're kind of stuck for 2 years. But then we had a breakthrough in about 2006 with new software that allowed us to go lower. And then the surprise of our lives happened when once again, and now very quickly, people piled up at the lowest frequency. Mm. So that was a message. And so we've been now undergoing several years of step-by-step marching to lower frequencies, following our clients, right? The clients, the most difficult clients, most challenging clients were always piling up at the lowest frequency. And that was a very clear message to us. And now this has been now a trajectory that's gone on for a dozen years, right, since 2006. And we're now at extremely low frequencies, and people are spread all over the spectrum. And so that has taken care of a lot of people that we used to not be able to help at all.
But technically speaking, it has been quite a challenge to go so low.
That's right. These low frequencies are extremely challenging to deal with in the equipment, and also it takes very great care on the part of the clinicians. And so it is a challenge in many ways. And then also the training is very strong, so you have to manage that. So it's indeed the most challenging work that we've ever done by far.
Because only a few weeks ago we were able, for the first time in the world, to go further down.
It's another step that we've just taken in the last few months, one more step lower in frequency. And the pattern just repeats. There's some people who just need to train about as low as we know how to go. And how do we understand that? The theory follows. The theory follows the findings. Right?
So it means that in some way, do you think that the practitioner, someone able to manage a session, is important in neurofeedback?
Well, in our kind of training, it's absolutely essential. You could not imagine this, people figuring this out on their own, right? It takes a very experienced person. We're dealing with basically a fairly straightforward technique. It's very complex in its own way, but it's not complex compared to the complexity of the brain. So we're using this relatively simple tool with the most complex entity in the universe, we think, which is the human brain. And unsurprisingly, when you're dealing with highly dysregulated brains, there are going to be surprises. And as a matter of fact, the surprises are routine. We expect surprise. That is the expectation. When you're working with a brain that you're not familiar with, you're going to be surprised. And so you need clinicians there to guide the process, to see what's going on. And it's actually the process itself that tells us how that person needs to be trained, right? We don't have a script ahead of time. Mm-hmm. We see how the brain responds to the signal, and then that leads us forward. If the person doesn't respond, we have no path forward.
So the practitioner has to be a specialist.
Absolutely, and experienced in this particular method. They can't just breeze in here and says, well, I know about neurofeedback, let me add it. That doesn't work. You know, they have to be very experienced in this method. And so there's a learning curve for everybody. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, all of us are on the same learning curve, end up on the same learning curve because the technique is still changing.
Mm-hmm. So you have been involved in neurofeedback since many years. What makes you start, and how did you come to this field?
Yeah, well, we got into this in 1985, and I was in aerospace research as a physicist, and we had a son who had been wrestling for many years with epilepsy, and we finally heard about this technique called neurofeedback. And Sue, whose background is neurophysiology, was immediately intrigued. And we signed up, and that changed Brian's life, and it changed our lives. We were immediately, we saw the potential of this. Of course, we didn't discover it. The people were already aware of the potential. But the fact is, we did bring something to the table. Sue was a neuroscientist, is a neuroscientist, trained at Cornell, and my background is in signal processing. So it was a fitting thing. There was only one piece missing, which is who's going to write the software. And a good friend of ours, family friend, did that part, worked for 3 years at no pay to develop the first instrument. And we're now in the third generation of instruments over the course of, each instrument working for us for about a decade.
So what are your interests today? What do you think you have to search in which direction?
Well, there are basically two approaches in the neurofeedback field. One is the standard conditioning technique called operant conditioning, where you're giving rewards and punishments, so to speak, right? Sort of guiding the brain in a particular channel to behave better. Now, we're using a different model, which is that of skill building, which is very different in the sense that here the brain is simply experiencing itself without judgment on our part. We're simply giving it information, and the brain sees itself in action, in a sense, and then uses that information for its own benefit, which is better regulation. And this is a direct analogy to the building a motor skill, a standard, the brain has to watch itself perform in order to learn a motor skill. And likewise here, when the brain watches itself in action, in the action of regulating itself, it can learn from that. So we're simply giving it an additional information path. And I think this is what's going to grow, and this is a principle that has broader application than just to the infra-low frequency region, right? It has general validity. Now, the important point is that when you're giving the brain marching orders in the operant conditioning design, then you're essentially narrowly focused. You're focused on one dimension, right? Whereas when the brain is working on this information, it is always working on its own priority. Now, what is going to be more effective, right? We're always working on the brain's own priority, which we don't know what it is, right? It's just looking at that information and acting on it, but always by its own wisdom. Well, of course, the whole thing rests on the brain. The whole process rests on the brain's wisdom, right? And now, when we're working in this skill building model, we're working at the very level of refinement where neuroregulation naturally has to take place. Whereas if you're telling the brain go, no go, you have to allow for a range. If you give the brain too many rewards and punishments, they lose meaning, right? They need to be special, which means they need to be relatively rare. But then the process is also inefficient. So we're dealing with a much more efficient process of learning here, which is essentially the finishing tool of all neurofeedback should be this kind of skill building, right? Even if you start somewhere else, this should be the end point. And we actually start there also, because at the low frequencies, we have no guidance to give. We don't know that terrain, right? We're stuck. We basically have no choice but to allow the brain to chart its own journey.
Mm-hmm. So do you think that neurofeedback is important for people, or will be more important?
Yes, what has happened, of course, in our journey to low frequency, we've learned how to deal with very difficult clients, right? They have been a challenge not only in mental health, they've been a challenge in healthcare in general, right? And so this is the challenge that confronts the world. We've got huge expenditures in the healthcare field. Who are the people that are costing all the money? It's these people, right? That the world has not known how to help. And so just on that problem alone, we're going to have a huge impact. But then it goes further, because it turns out all of us benefit from these same techniques. So all of us benefit from the opportunity to go back to the very foundation of our regulatory hierarchy and build up from there, right? And that's what we're doing. In the infra-low frequency region, we're going to the very foundations of our regulatory hierarchy, because that's also the frequency hierarchy. The lowest frequencies govern everything that happens at higher frequencies.
You mean that the main frequency is
yeah, so that all those frequencies down there in the infra-low jointly determine how well the brain functions in the EEG range. You know, which we've been long acquainted with.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So what is your vision of the future of neurofeedback?
The basic message is this, that we really do not know the inherent competence of any nervous system until it has a chance to train, right? And that's critical. As soon as you know this, there's a kind of ethical burden that goes along with that, which means we really need to give every child an opportunity to train his or her brain. And now we know the process can start very early. So I now have a 1-year-old grandson who already has had the electrodes on his head.
Wow.
To everyone's betterment, his own and everyone else in the family as well, right? So when that door opens, right, you immediately see that this is going to be relevant across the entire realm of healthcare, from pediatrics to geriatrics, right? It's going to be relevant to the school system. It's going to be relevant to criminal justice. This is a transformative event. The discovery, it will be seen in retrospect, one of the significant discoveries of this 20th century was the discovery of neurofeedback.
And mainly the infra-low frequency.
And the infra-low is kind of a major step within that framework, because it now works with regulation the way it needs to be worked with, right? Which is, you put the brain in charge. That, therapists always want to be in charge, right? So we have to act like we understand this stuff, and we have, with every client, we have to understand, give him or her to understand that we actually know what we're doing, and so forth. So there's this burden on the clinician to appear competent, right? But we're dealing with a human brain. Who can speak of competence at this point? No, we're novices at the frontier of the brain, and so absolutely the best thing we can do is to allow the brain to take the lead. And that turns out to be, when it comes to regulation, the right thing to do anyhow. So we have found our way from the conditioning model, which all of us were involved in early on, right, to the skill building model, where the brain is in charge. And that opens the door, essentially, not only to the taking care of the deficit folks, the desperate clients, and patients, but also there's the experiential side, there's the optimum functioning side, right? The experiential side, meaning the people who are interested in mindfulness and meditation.
Peak performance too.
And then there's the peak performance aspect. The whole professional core, sports people and so forth, for whom it is important to extract every bit of performance that they can.
I think you should receive the Nobel Prize.
That's premature. But
thank you so much.
No. In any case, it should be Sue, not me. So.
Okay, thank you.